My name is Dominique Hazzard. I am a food justice advocate, a Ward 8 resident, and the board chair of DC Greens, which is a local health equity organization here in DC. I'm also a PhD candidate in history at Johns Hopkins, where I study African American food and environmental history. And I was the junior curator of Food for the People, Eating and Activism in Greater Washington, an exhibit here at the Smithsonian Anacostia Community Museum. Folks might be familiar with the term food desert. Here in this exhibit, we talk about the issue of food apartheid because that really gets at all of the systems and policies that create low food access in low income and African American neighborhoods here in DC. And so we have a section in the exhibition talking about the grocery gap. Here in DC, our grocery gap means we have one grocery store here in Ward 8 for about 85,000 people, whereas in Ward 3, there are 9 grocery stores for about the same amount of people. So a huge discrepancy in access to fresh food. When we look at why is there a grocery gap here in DC? Why do low-income communities in the city, Black communities in the city and in the DC suburbs not have access to grocery stores? We can trace it back to a few different historical factors. One is simply the industrialization of the food system in the middle of the 20th century and the consolidation of the industry, the rise of the supermarkets. Instead of going to a bunch of neighborhood stores, folks are going to these more centralized supermarkets. But also the fact that this happens in tandem with the height of redlining, residential segregation in the city, and also the structural abandonment of Black neighborhoods, especially after the 1968 uprisings. So all these factors together create a perfect storm where from about the mid-60s to the mid-70s, we see a massive flight of supermarkets from DC's Black neighborhoods into the suburbs. When I used to work in the food policy space in DC, trying to address food apartheid, a question would often come up in the meetings: why is there only one grocery store in Ward 8 or 2 in Ward 7? And often the answer was something like, well, they're low-income neighborhoods or they're predominantly Black neighborhoods. And something about that really never sat right with me. It made me wonder, is it automatic that if you are in a low-income neighborhood, there won't be access to fresh food? And that's really the question that inspired me to become a historian and started my journey to entering the Hopkins PhD program. And so when we look back at it, we find that there was a time when all the neighborhoods in DC, even the low-income neighborhoods, even the predominantly Black neighborhoods in DC, did have access to fresh food retail stores, farmers markets, food halls like Eastern Market. And what happens is, one, the industrialization of the food system, the development of the supermarket sector that really consolidates food access into just a few points across the city. And then that is happening in tandem with things like redlining and the effects of residential segregation. And so when we have desegregation of schools in DC, we have that massive wave of that exodus into the suburbs. So many of the city's supermarkets follow those folks. And then the second historical issue that's shaped our current food apartheid landscape is definitely the 1968 uprisings, which in many ways were a response to the poor experiences and treatments that African Americans in the city experienced as consumers. And then after the 1968 uprising, there is structural abandonment of DC's Black neighborhoods, so that for the next 50 years, we continue to go without access to grocery stores. The Eastern Shore of Maryland is a huge center for the poultry industry for the whole country. This is 523 million chickens grown there every year. So the Eastern Shore is a center of chicken processing, largely due to Frank Perdue, who revolutionized, honestly, the way that chicken is produced and marketed in this country. So fun fact is, before the era where he gained traction as a businessman, most Americans, if you're eating chicken, it's probably because you have a chicken in your yard. You might get one from your local butcher, but Franklin Perdue sees this opportunity to mass produce chickens and also to convince Americans to eat more chicken. And the Eastern Shore of Maryland also has a long history of relying upon African American food workers, whether for farming or whether for this type of work. And the development of the poultry industry on the Eastern Shore is in many ways due to Frank Perdue, who's from Maryland's Eastern Shore, and he really developed our contemporary system of factory farming chickens at a large scale. And this work was primarily done by African Americans, especially African American women working in these processing plants. Today, most of the work is done by Latino and Haitian migrant workers. And these are some of the most dangerous jobs in the country. Really high rates of amputations, repetitive motion injuries, and also respiratory illnesses. And these issues are exacerbated by the status of these workers. In the early 20th century, these are African American communities living under the shadow of Jim Crow. And today, migrant workers are mistreated often because of their legal status. The Eastern Shore is also a center of the seafood industry, right? This is where our crabs are coming from, those famous blue crabs from the region. But that industry is highly reliant on migrant workers. This also used to be primarily an African American workforce. Today, it's almost 100% Mexican workers who come to the Eastern Shore each year to work in the seafood processing plants on something called an H-2B visa. And these visas can be a very precarious setup for the employees and also for the business owners. The federal government only releases a certain number of these visas every year, and then the employers have to try to get as many as they can to satisfy their labor needs. And some years they do, and some years they don't. So if your seafood processing plant doesn't have enough visas that year, you simply aren't coming. You're going to stay in Mexico or perhaps find another type of migrant job. But that really affects the workers, and it also affects the industry as a whole when they can't get enough labor, and it affects consumers as well. As we see, this is one of the factors that contributes to the fluctuations in seafood prices each year. These jobs in the poultry processing plants are very dangerous jobs, really high rates of amputations where folks might have fingers, limbs cut off. Repetitive motion injuries like claw hand is something we talk about in the exhibition. There's a woman who no longer can move her fingers, and that's because the work is done assembly line style. So you have your one cut that you are doing, and that's what you're gonna do all day. And then also the air in the plants is not amazing. And this really exacerbates the COVID-19 pandemic for the Eastern Shore as a whole, because such a large percentage of folks on the Eastern Shore are employed by or in close contact with people who are employed by these plants. And unfortunately, in the early days of the pandemic, what we saw is that many of the plants were not moving workers farther apart. They were not providing appropriate PPE. They were not providing information about the virus in the different languages that these migrant workers at the plants speak. And so the Eastern Shore became an early and very severe hotspot of the COVID-19 pandemic. In the Food for the People exhibition, we look at one plant and a vigil that the workers at that plant held. And there's 5 hard hats on this vigil, and that's a photo taken in April 2020. So those workers lost 5 of their coworkers to COVID-19 just in the first month, or the first 2 months of the pandemic. Workers on the Eastern Shore really mobilized around this, as well as the faith community on the Eastern Shore. And so there's an important group called CATA, which is a farm workers organization that really organized to for the state government to put some regulations on these plants around COVID-19, get that PPE, get that information out to the workers. And so it was really a result of that worker level organizing that eventually made the situation a bit better. A food culture is the thing that makes the food in each place special. What is it? Food is one of those things that is gonna make DC different from Denver, right? Different from small town Missouri. Every place has those cuisines that are popular in that community, those special restaurants that you can only find in that community. So the food culture is all those things that come together that define the culinary culture of a place. Food is one of the things that defines the identity of a community. It's something that connects us to our neighborhoods, to our families, to our cultures. As gentrification in DC has progressed, and here in the exhibit we really look at that over the past 20 or so years, that not only can displace residents, displace businesses, but it changes the food culture of the city as well. And so one way we can look at that is through the impact on legacy Black food businesses. Those restaurants that were here serving folks in DC before it was cute, before it was trendy to do that, who increasingly can no longer afford to maintain their businesses here in DC because of skyrocketing commercial rent. So in the exhibition, we look at the example of Horace and Dickey's, which was an iconic restaurant on our 8th Street corridor, famous for their fried fish sandwiches, that was forced to close its doors. It also comes into play around issues of identity, belonging, and appropriation. So in the exhibition, we also examine mumbo sauce, which folks familiar with DC culture might know about our beloved condiment. Mumbo sauce is the signature condiment of Washington, D.C. I think it tastes kind of like a cross between a barbecue sauce and a sweet and sour sauce. But folks have been whipping it up in D.C. since the 50s, and usually you'll eat it with some fried chicken and fries from a carry-out restaurant. But mumbo sauce, for example, is more than a condiment. It's a symbol in this fight against displacement, and you can see how food emerges in these struggles when we look at how mumbo sauce is now something that was invented by working class African Americans, now being served in very fancy restaurants downtown, while the communities that invented this sauce can no longer afford to live in the city. So we look at mumbo sauce as and who's profiting from mumbo sauce as an example of the larger trend in society of folks wanting Black culture without Black people.